Welcome to Ember Hollow, a tiny village hidden between the mountains where dragons fill the sky. Magical fires light the streets, and every young dragon is waiting for the day they discover what makes them special. And that brings us to Pip. Pip is a little dragon with a very unusual gift. Whenever he feels a big emotion, his scales change color. But there's one thing Pip hasn't figured out yet: how to breathe fire like the other dragons. Tonight, when a terrible storm causes Ember Hollow's great flame to go out, Pip will have to leave the safety of home, enter a mysterious mountain, make a very small new friend, and discover that being brave doesn't mean you're never scared. Sometimes being brave just means taking one more tiny step. So get cozy, snuggle in, and let's begin our very first adventure with Pip the Color-Changing Dragon. High above the clouds where the mountains were so tall that their snowy peaks sometimes seemed to tickle the stars, there was a little village called Ember Hollow. It was a village built by dragons for dragons, and nearly everything there had something to do with fire. Warm orange lanterns hung outside crooked stone houses. Bakers used little puffs of flame to roast cinnamon buns in outdoor ovens. Dragon families gathered around fireplaces at night, and every evening the oldest dragons tended the great flame in the center of the village. The great flame had burned for longer than anyone could remember, and its golden light could be seen from the mountain trails for miles. Travelers used it to find their way home. Families gathered around it during festivals, and young dragons dreamed about the day they would be old enough to help keep it burning. In a small round house near the edge of Ember Hollow lived a young dragon named Pip. Pip had warm red-orange scales, a creamy yellow belly, two dark little horns, small wings, big curious eyes, and an ember-shaped marking on his chest. He was smaller than most dragons his age, but Pip didn't mind being small. Being small meant he could squeeze through tiny spaces when exploring, hide behind flower pots when playing games, and curl himself into such a perfect little ball beneath his blankets that his mother sometimes pretended she couldn't find him at bedtime. Pip was curious about almost everything. He loved climbing rocks, collecting shiny stones, exploring little mountain paths, watching clouds drift through the valley, and helping his neighbors whenever he could. There was only one thing Pip absolutely did not like, and for a dragon, it was a rather inconvenient thing to be afraid of. Pip was afraid of fire. Pip didn't dislike warm things. He loved hot cocoa so much that he sometimes asked for it even in summer. He loved sitting beneath a thick blanket near the fireplace, although he always chose the chair farthest from the flames. His favorite treat was a marshberry, a small purple berry that became sweet and fluffy when toasted. Pip simply preferred when somebody else did the toasting. Whenever a flame suddenly jumped or crackled, Pip's stomach tightened, his little wings folded against his back, and something happened that he found terribly embarrassing. Pip changed color. All dragons in Pip's family had scales that could change color, but grown dragons learned how to control them. Pip had not. His colors seemed to have a mind of their own and changed whenever his feelings became too strong. When Pip was especially happy, golden patches appeared across his cheeks and belly. When something made him curious, the end of his tail turned turquoise. When he became embarrassed, he turned pink from his nose all the way to the tip of his tail. When Pip felt proud, his scales became a rich, glowing orange. Most noticeable of all was what happened whenever Pip became frightened. Every warm red-orange scale on his body turned bright blue. Pip could say he wasn't scared as many times as he wanted, but his scales always told the truth. One morning, Pip hurried into the village square and discovered the other young dragons gathered around their teacher, Elder Moss. Pip immediately remembered why everyone was there and felt his stomach twist. It was first flame day, the day young dragons practiced breathing fire for the very first time. Pip had known the day was coming and had practiced alone in his bedroom for weeks. He would stand in front of his mirror, plant his feet firmly on the floor, puff out his chest, take a deep breath, and imagine a magnificent flame shooting across the room. In his imagination, Pip was excellent at breathing fire. He could light 10 candles at once, toast 20 marshberries in a row, and send enormous spirals of flame into the sky. Imaginary fire didn't frighten him at all. Unfortunately, first flame day involved real fire. Elder Moss placed a practice stone in the center of the square, and one by one, the young dragons stepped forward. A green dragon named Fern went first and produced a flame no larger than a candle. Everyone cheered as though she had breathed enough fire to light the entire mountain. A purple dragon named Juniper tried next, but halfway through her attempt, she sneezed and accidentally sent 3 tiny fireballs bouncing harmlessly across the practice stones. Even Juniper laughed as Elder Moss hurried around stamping them out. Then a large orange dragon named Bramble stepped forward and breathed such a powerful flame that Elder Moss's eyebrows curled upward from the heat. Soon everyone had tried except Pip. Pip slowly walked toward the practice stone while Elder Moss reminded him that there was no hurry. Pip planted his feet exactly as he had practiced at home, raised his head, puffed out his chest, and filled his lungs with air. For a moment he actually believed he could do it. Then Elder Moss lit the small practice torch in front of him. Pip stared at the dancing orange flame, and before he could stop himself, every scale on his body turned bright blue. He squeezed his eyes shut and blew as hard as he could, but nothing happened. He tried again and produced a tiny grey cloud from his nostrils. On his third attempt, one lonely spark floated from his nose, hovered in the air for half a second, and disappeared. When Pip opened his eyes, nobody was laughing. Fern gave him an encouraging smile. Juniper looked as though she wanted him to try again. Even Bramble seemed disappointed for him, rather than amused. Elder Moss explained that first flames arrived when they were ready. Some dragons discovered theirs early, some later, and neither was better than the other. Pip nodded and tried to smile, but embarrassment washed over him anyway. His bright blue scales immediately turned pink, which only embarrassed him more. He hurried away from the practice stone, wishing, for once, that his colors would keep his feelings to themselves. For the rest of the day, Pip couldn't stop thinking about his missing flame. Every dragon in Ember Hollow could breathe fire. Fire wasn't simply something dragons did for fun. It warmed their homes, cooked their food, lit their lanterns, and had been part of their village for generations. Pip began wondering whether something was wrong with him. Maybe he wasn't brave enough. Maybe his flame would never come. The more he thought about it, the more worried he became. And the more worried he became, the bluer his scales turned. That evening, Pip's mother found him sitting alone on a grassy hill overlooking Ember Hollow. Below them, hundreds of warm lights filled the village, and at its centre burned the great flame. Pip eventually asked whether she had ever been afraid of fire when she was young. His mother thought for a moment and told him she hadn't been afraid of fire, but she had been terrified of flying. Pip stared at her in disbelief because his mother could fly through mountain storms without seeming frightened at all. She laughed and explained that being able to do something now didn't mean you had never been afraid to do it. When she was Pip's age, she had been certain her wings would stop working the moment her feet left the ground. Pip asked how she had stopped being scared. His mother explained that she hadn't waited until the fear disappeared. One day, she had climbed onto a very small rock, opened her wings and jumped. The next day, she tried from a slightly bigger rock. Eventually, she discovered that her wings knew what to do, even while the rest of her was frightened. Then she told Pip something he would remember for the rest of his life. Being brave didn't mean you weren't scared. Sometimes being brave meant being scared and taking one tiny step anyway. Pip wasn't completely convinced, but he liked the idea of only needing one tiny step. One tiny step sounded much easier than suddenly becoming fearless. That night, a storm rolled over the mountains. At first, Pip enjoyed lying in bed and listening to the rain tapping gently against his window. Soon, however, the wind grew stronger. Thunder shook the little stone house, and flashes of lightning turned Pip's bedroom white for an instant before darkness returned. Pip pulled his blanket higher and watched the storm from his pillow until an enormous gust swept through Ember Hollow. The lantern outside his window disappeared. A moment later, another gust struck the village, stronger than the first, and bells began ringing outside. Pip hurried to his window and looked toward the village square. For a moment, he couldn't understand what was wrong. Then he realized what was missing. The great flame had gone out. For the first time anyone in Ember Hollow could remember, the center of the village was completely dark. Dragons hurried from their homes carrying lanterns and covering their heads from the rain. Elder Moss and several others tried to relight the great flame, but the storm extinguished every spark before it could catch. One by one, the remaining lanterns around the village began going dark as well. Pip's mother explained that the great flame was not ordinary fire. Long ago, it had been lit using a living ember from the ember tree, an ancient tree that grew inside a cavern high above the village. Normally, an older dragon could fly to the cavern, collect another ember, and return within minutes. Nobody could safely fly through a storm this strong, so several adults prepared to climb the mountain instead. Before they could leave, lightning struck somewhere above the village. A tremendous crack echoed through the valley, followed by the rumble of falling stone. Part of the mountainside collapsed across the main trail, completely blocking the route to the ember tree. There was one other way into the cavern, but it was an old passage so narrow that none of the adult dragons could fit through it. Pip knew the passage immediately. He had discovered the little opening months earlier while searching for shiny stones and had squeezed through part of it before turning around. Pip also knew something else. He was small enough to fit. The moment the adults looked toward him, Pip's stomach tightened and his scales turned bright blue. His mother immediately told him he didn't have to go. Nobody would ask him to enter the mountain alone, especially during a storm. Pip almost felt relieved. He could return home, climb beneath his blankets, and wait for the adults to find another solution. Then he looked around Ember Hollow. Young dragons huddled beside their parents as the village became colder and darker. Bakers carried warm blankets from their kitchens. Elder Moss was organizing the few lanterns that still burned. Pip looked toward the mountain and felt afraid. But somewhere beneath that fear, he remembered sitting on the hill with his mother. He didn't have to stop being scared. He only needed to take one tiny step. Pip packed a small bag with water, a glowing crystal, some food, and the metal lantern Elder Moss gave him for carrying the living ember. He put on his yellow raincoat and started toward the mountain. Fern insisted on traveling with him as far as she could. The storm made the familiar trail look like an entirely different world. Trees bent beneath the wind, rain rushed over the stones in tiny rivers, and thunder rolled through the valley. Pip's scales remained blue beneath his raincoat almost the entire way, but he kept walking. Every time he wanted to turn around, he concentrated only on the next step. Eventually, Pip and Fern reached the entrance to the old passage. Fern tried squeezing inside but quickly became stuck at the shoulders and had to wiggle backward. Pip would have to continue alone. He stood at the entrance looking into the dark tunnel and considered turning around. Fern noticed his blue scales and smiled before telling him that blue was actually a very nice color on him. Pip laughed despite himself, and for a moment his scales became purple as nervousness mixed with happiness. Then he hugged Fern, took his glowing crystal from his bag, and squeezed into the tunnel. Inside the mountain, the storm became a distant rumble. Pip crawled through the narrow passage until it gradually became wide enough for him to walk. The last bit of daylight disappeared behind him, leaving only the soft glow of the crystal in his paws. The cave walls sparkled whenever the light passed over them. Strange crystals grew from the stone. Underground streams crossed the path, and tiny silver insects hurried into cracks whenever Pip approached. His fear slowly mixed with curiosity, and the end of his blue tail became turquoise. After walking for some time, Pip heard a faint squeaking sound. He followed it into a small opening and discovered a tiny mountain mouse trapped beneath a fallen branch. Pip put down his bag and pushed against the branch. It was heavier than he expected, but he kept pushing until it finally rolled aside. The little mouse scrambled free and looked up at him. Pip smiled, and golden patches appeared across his cheeks. He expected the mouse to run away, but instead, she followed him back to the tunnel. Pip decided to call her Pebble because she was tiny, grey, and almost perfectly round. Pip and Pebble continued deeper into the mountain until the tunnel suddenly opened into an enormous cavern. Pip stopped in amazement. Hundreds of glowing crystals covered the walls and ceiling, reflecting turquoise, purple, pink, and gold across a dark underground lake. His scales turned turquoise with curiosity until he almost seemed to glow along with the cavern. Across the water stood a narrow stone bridge, and beyond the bridge grew something Pip had only heard about in stories. The ember tree was enormous. Its silver-white trunk rose directly from the stone, twisting into branches that stretched across the cavern ceiling. Thousands of glowing orange leaves covered its canopy, and hanging among them were tiny living flames. Pip's turquoise scales immediately turned blue. There was more fire on the ember tree than he had ever seen in one place, but the flames behaved differently from ordinary fire. They floated quietly among the branches like glowing fruit, warming the cavern with soft golden light. Pip crossed the stone bridge slowly, with Pebble riding on his shoulder. When he reached the tree, he placed Elder Moss's metal lantern on the ground and looked upward. All he needed to do was collect one living ember and put it inside. Unfortunately, the lowest ember hung several feet above his head. Pip jumped, but missed. He jumped again and missed by even more. He tried climbing the silver trunk, but it was so smooth that he slid immediately back to the ground. Pebble watched from a nearby rock as Pip tried several more times without success. Then Pip remembered his wings. They were very small wings, and Pip had never flown more than a few feet. But they were still wings. He climbed onto a rock, stretched them as wide as he could, and jumped. His wings fluttered wildly. For one glorious second, Pip was flying. Then he landed face first in a patch of soft moss. When he lifted his head, Pebble was squeaking so loudly that Pip was fairly certain she was laughing at him. Pip laughed too, climbed back onto the rock and tried again. On his second attempt, Pip reached the lowest branch and grabbed it with both paws. The branch bent beneath his weight until one of the glowing embers hung directly in front of him. Pip froze. The tiny flame danced only inches from his nose. Every scale on his body became the brightest blue it had ever been. His paws tightened around the branch, and for several seconds he couldn't make himself move. Then the mountain trembled. Somewhere beyond the cavern, thunder boomed, and a crack appeared across part of the stone bridge. Pip realized the storm was getting worse. Ember Hollow was waiting. His mother was waiting. Fern was waiting. Everyone was waiting. Pip stared at the tiny flame and remembered one tiny step. He slowly reached one paw toward the ember. The closer he came, the more frightened he felt. But he didn't pull away. Finally, his paw touched the living flame. Pip expected it to burn, but instead it felt pleasantly warm, almost like holding a cup of hot cocoa on a cold morning. Pip carefully lifted the ember from the branch and placed it inside Elder Moss's lantern. Golden light immediately filled the glass. Pip looked down at himself and discovered that his blue scales were changing. Blue became turquoise. Turquoise became purple. Purple became orange. And finally, his entire body became bright golden yellow. He had been afraid, and he had done it anyway. Another tremor shook the cavern. The crack in the bridge widened, and several stones fell into the dark water below. Pip grabbed the lantern and hurried toward the tunnel with Pebble clinging to his shoulder. Halfway across the bridge, another section collapsed behind him. Pip ran as quickly as his little legs could carry him, but the crack spread ahead of him until a gap opened across the path. There was no way around it. Pip looked at the other side, looked at his small wings, and jumped. For a moment there was nothing beneath him. Pip opened his wings and felt the air catch them. He didn't soar gracefully through the cavern like an adult dragon. His legs kicked, his wings flapped much too quickly, and Pebble held onto one of his horns with all four paws. Somehow, it worked. Pip crossed the gap and landed safely on the other side. He laughed so loudly that the sound echoed through the cavern, and his scales flashed purple, gold, turquoise, orange, and pink all at once. Pip raced through the tunnels carrying the glowing lantern until he finally saw daylight ahead. Fern was waiting at the entrance and nearly knocked him over when she hugged him. The storm had begun to weaken, and together they hurried down the mountain toward Ember Hollow. By the time they reached the village, nearly every remaining lantern had gone dark. Dragons gathered silently around the empty stone basin where the great flame usually burned. Pip walked into the center of the village carrying the living ember. His scales glowed warm orange with pride as Elder Moss carefully opened the lantern and placed the ember inside the stone basin. Everyone waited. The ember glowed, but nothing else happened. Elder Moss blew gently across it, causing the tiny flame to brighten, but the great flame did not return. Fern stepped forward and breathed a small flame into the basin. Nothing happened. Bramble tried next, filling the basin with enough fire to make everyone step backward. But when his flame disappeared, the little ember remained exactly as it had been. Elder Moss stared at the ember and suddenly understood. The living flame of the ember tree had been carried down the mountain by Pip. Pip had touched it, protected it, and brought it home. The ember had chosen him as its keeper, which meant the great flame would only answer Pip's fire. Pip's proud orange scales immediately turned blue. Pip stared at the little ember in the basin. Everyone in Ember Hollow was watching him, but nobody laughed or hurried him. His mother stepped through the crowd and stood nearby. She didn't tell him not to be afraid because they both knew he was afraid. She didn't promise that everything would work because neither of them knew if it would. She simply smiled, and Pip remembered the hill overlooking Ember Hollow and the words she had given him. One tiny step. Pip walked toward the basin. His legs trembled. His scales remained blue. He looked into the tiny living flame, filled his lungs with air, and tried. The first attempt produced nothing. Pip took another breath and tried again. A tiny spark appeared in front of his nose and disappeared. He could feel fear telling him to stop. But this time, Pip knew fear didn't get to make the decision. He took one more breath, puffed out his chest, and blew. A tiny flame appeared. It wasn't enormous like Bramble's. It wasn't even as large as Fern's first flame. Pip's fire was no bigger than the flame on a birthday candle, but it was his. The little flame floated forward and touched the living ember. For half a second, nothing happened. Then golden light rushed through the basin. The great flame exploded upward in a magnificent swirl of orange, gold, pink, purple, blue, and green. Warm light spread across Ember Hollow. Lanterns around the square suddenly flickered back to life, and every dragon in the village began cheering. Pip opened his eyes in amazement. His scales changed faster than they ever had before. Blue became purple. Purple became pink. Pink became orange, and orange became brilliant gold. Then every colour Pip had ever turned rippled across his body at once. He laughed as Fern and the other young dragons surrounded him. Pip had breathed fire. It had been tiny fire, but that tiny flame had been enough to relight the entire village. Later that night, after the storm had disappeared beyond the mountains and stars returned above Ember Hollow, Pip sat beside the great flame with his mother, Fern, Elder Moss, and a very comfortable mountain mouse named Pebble. Pip decided he wanted to toast a marshberry himself. His first attempt produced only smoke. His second attempt created a spark that accidentally toasted the end of his own nose, turning his scales bright pink while everyone laughed. On his third attempt, Pip produced a perfect little flame. He carefully toasted the marshberry until it became warm and fluffy, then handed it to Pebble, who ate the entire thing before Pip could change his mind. Pip was still afraid of big fires. His fear had not magically disappeared because of one adventure. Sudden flames still sometimes turned him blue, and he knew there would be days when breathing fire felt difficult again. But Pip understood something he hadn't understood on first flame day. He didn't need to wait for fear to disappear before doing something brave. He could be scared. He could turn blue. His legs could shake. His wings could tremble. And his stomach could feel as though it were full of butterflies. He could feel all of those things and still take one tiny step forward. When it was finally time for bed, Pip carried Pebble home with him. The little mouse curled into a ball beside his pillow while Pip climbed beneath his blankets. Through his bedroom window, he could see the great flame glowing in the center of Ember Hollow. Pip smiled, remembering that his tiny flame had helped bring it back. Just as he began closing his eyes, his nose tickled. Pip sneezed, and a tiny spark shot across the room and lit the candle on his bedside table. Pip's eyes grew enormous, and his entire body turned bright pink. Pebble lifted her head and squeaked at him. Pip stared at the little candle flame for a moment, then started laughing. Golden patches appeared across his pink cheeks as he pulled the blanket beneath his chin. Perhaps fire was still a little scary, but Pip decided that was okay. There were many things in the world that could be scary, and there were many adventures still waiting for him beyond Ember Hollow. He didn't have to be fearless to find them. He only had to be Pip, colors and all, and keep taking one tiny step at a time. Outside his window, Ember Hollow glowed warmly beneath the stars. High on the mountain, the ember tree shimmered quietly inside its hidden cavern, and in the center of the village, the great flame burned brighter than ever. As Pip finally drifted to sleep, the little ember-shaped marking on his chest gave off the faintest golden glow, almost as if it knew something Pip didn't yet know. Finding his first flame had only been the beginning of his adventures.